Good morning. We are here for this masterclass. I would like us to start. I have been asked to steer this ship. That is going to be a conversation, that is going to be a dialogue about this critical issue that the country is grappling with to try and set our tone in the transformative mission of our country and making sure that there is meritocratic type of public servants for our country to ensure that the capability of our state, the capability of our government, and the capability of the public service that is meant to be the catalytic role to take us to a developmental state is built. But this conversation should be able to take us there, and mine is really to welcome everyone and open and say, let's start listening to this conversation, to this dialogue between these two people that we have here. One of them is my boss, my former boss, and we still miss that voice. We still need that guidance. He has started giving us his thoughts around this issue. But before we get to that, we would like to welcome everyone. We would like to acknowledge the presence and attendance of our former president, Dr. Kgalema Motlanthe. I have also seen Mekuku. And we also have our ministers in our midst. We also have our DGs in our midst. We welcome them, including our DG in the presidency. We welcome all MECs. We welcome all public servants. We also welcome everybody else from all the other social sectors, all social partners that have also put a hand in the development agenda and trajectory of our country. We welcome one, we welcome all to this particular deliberation, this dialogue, and this conversation that matters for the better aspiration of our country to see South Africa as a developmental state one day. We have in our midst the two panelists. I don't know if they are panelists, but these are the people who are going to run this conversation. We have this conversation that has been arranged. It is between Dr. Lee, Dr. Eric Lee, and Dr. Cassius Lubisi. They are talking to us about this transformative mission of meritocratic bureaucracies. Dr. Lee is a Chinese venture capitalist and an influential political scientist. He is the founder of Tsinghua Capital and the trustee of the China Institute for Fudan University. And Dr. Lubisi is an accomplished academic, advisor, educationalist. He is also a senior public sector executive. He retired in 2020, just last year, from his position as the Director General in the presidency and as the Secretary of Cabinet in the presidency. So what we are having now is this conversation, and we are hoping that as we introduce our speakers, they are here in our midst, and we can see them, both of them. And by the time we get to their conversation, it will only be them talking to each other, conversing between the two of them, and addressing the challenges and the questions that we continuously ponder upon in terms of this transformation in our country. With that, I would really like to hand over to the principal of the School of Government, Professor Busani Ngangweni, to tell us the objectives of today, why we are here, and what we would really love to achieve by the end of this conversation. Principal, over to you.
Thank you, Program Director, Dr. Kifilo Masiteng, the Deputy Secretary of the National Planning Commission. We are grateful that you were able to come and steer the ship this morning. And I must thank our distinguished panelists today, Dr. Eric Lee, who is joining us from Shanghai, as well as Dr. Kesha Lubisi, who's joining us from Pretoria. Now, Drs. Lee and Lubisi, are distinguished, scholars in their own rights. They are senior fellows of the National School of Government, and today we thought we'll put them together in a different format of a masterclass because it will take the form of a conversation. The National School of Government is hosting a series of master classes by way of bringing high-level, speakers to engage in various conversations with the leaders in the public sector in South Africa. And here I'm talking about both elected as well as appointed leaders in the public sector in the country. We're a very diverse range of people who come here occasionally to engage with the public sector leaders on various topical issues that those of us who are in the employ of the public service are interested to engage in. We've dealt with issues of managing pandemics, how it has impacted on us in the public sector space. We have dealt with issues of complexity of governance with some of our friends from the Civil Service College. And we also had a very big masterclass last year, which, courtesy of the SABC, was also televised live with Mariana Mazzucato, and the president being a student in that particular masterclass. This is a second masterclass that Dr. Lee is doing. He did one last year with the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, who was a respondent. This time around is taking a different form and shape. Now, these masterclasses do matter, colleagues, and the questions that we have asked here, which are the three questions, are the ones that they will be grappling with. It is not only South Africa as a developing country that is grappling with the issue of transforming a bureaucracy to make sure that this bureaucracy becomes a meritocratic-based bureaucracy and that it can meet the aspirations of its citizens. There are countries like China, as Dr. Lee will indicate, who've gone through a similar path over many years. There are countries that have tried and failed, and some countries indeed have succeeded. So in the intervention that they will be making today, they will be drawing on history, their reading of history, but also doing some forecasting of whether or not it is possible for South Africa to become a developmental state driven by a bureaucracy based on merit, but in particular, that is transformative. And we're very deliberate in choosing the topic of the transformative mission, because at the end of the day, you can have the best engineers, the best mathematicians in the public sector. If they don't see their mission as being transformative, the society will stagnate. And there are many countries with some of the best learned people that have stagnated. Hence, we are insisting that in this conversation, we must talk about the transformative mission of these bureaucracies. In the three questions that you see on the screen now, we will also put a link on a Mentimeter. We will invite all of you to participate and engage with these questions as the conversation proceeds. So you will have them in your chat. You don't need to worry to take them down right now. Our view is, as the National School of Government, everybody in the public sector, elected and appointed, must return to the simulator, because the complexity of managing public affairs requires that we constantly sharpen our abilities to manage the state and the society. So basically, we are saying that as a National School of Government, as we return to the simulator, it's either we go through class physically, we go through online learning, or we go through virtual space as we are doing today, as we will be learning from the perspectives that will be shared by our distinguished panelists today. Partnerships are the future. We are bringing scholars like Dr. Lee and many others from all over the world, because the South African public service, we need to learn as much from everybody else in the world, whilst we develop our own unique and home-based solutions to the challenges facing society as well. Our motto as the NSG is learn, serve, grow. We believe that if public servants, appointed and elected, continuously learn, they will master statecraft, in which case they will be able to serve their communities diligently. And lastly, everybody wants to grow in their profession. Hence, we are bringing conversations like this one. Thank you very much once again for being here. We welcome the leadership, former president, all the ministers, the DGs, and all other people who are attending this session today. Back to you, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Principal. We will, with those questions that our panelists, our conversers, and those who are leading our dialogue today should answer, I would immediately start with Dr. Eric Lee to kindly give us his sense of what is it that he thinks this transformative mission should be able to be catered through, and what does it need? What catalyst should be there to make it a mission that is achievable? Dr. Lee, over to you. Dr. Lee, if you have started talking, you are still muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you are fine now.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, professors, and it's an honor to be here. It's my second time giving a master class to your great group, so it's also a learning experience for me. So today, I'd like to share with you my thoughts about the DNA of China's governance model, and I'd like to try to answer a critical question, whether it can adapt. Okay, so obviously, you know, Chinese governance has been, to a large extent, a great success in the last few decades. So if you look at sorry, 怎么弄啊？那就可以，已经在放了，左边就。啊 ，OK， sorry。没用啊。And the Chinese governance has been successful. If you look, I pulled some numbers from these are old numbers, but from 2000 to 2015. So in the last 5 years, I think the numbers have even gone further in the same direction. If we look at all the developing countries, if we look at BRICS, for instance, in the last, from 2000 to 2015, in those 15 years, you can see that China's growth is the most significant among BRICS. It's in fact, in 2000, when the term BRICS was coined, it held great promise. Everybody was hoping these countries will grow and will become significant factors in the global economy. But as you can see, unfortunately, China is the only one that excelled in this period of globalization. The US, of course, their share of GDP had declined, of the global GDP. China's share had gone up 10x from 2000 to 2015. And I think in the last 6 years, it's gone up further to closer to 20%. So it's probably 13, maybe 15x, where the other 4 countries in BRICS had pretty much been stalling, unfortunately. So China's governance obviously has been a success. So today I want to share with you, what's the DNA of that governance, and can it be applied over a long period of time? The question is, can it continue to be successful, I think, is the question we need to answer. So when I think about Chinese governance, I know today our primary topic is about meritocratic governance, but I like to summarize into 3 primary elements to Chinese governance. One is meritocratic governance, which is our main topic today. Second is experimental governance, and the third is entrepreneurial governance. And I argue this is a unique combination for contemporary Chinese politics. Okay, I'll go into meritocratic governance in more details, but let me touch on experimental governance and entrepreneurial governance. Experimental governance means that they have figured out a way when they want to experiment with policies, when they think about a particular policy, right? They try it first. They have these, I mean, I think China is the largest governance or policy laboratory in the world. Okay, what they do is they define a problem, whether it's demographic or economic development, and they design some policies, but they're not sure if they're going to work, right? So they pick a county or a small city in some province, and they try it there first. And a lot of policies don't work, so they ditch that. Okay, but for those policies that seem to work in a small area, they then take it to a few other places in the same province. If that continues to work, then they enlarge it to the province level. If that worked, then they try to introduce that nationwide. So it's kind of a unique way of experimenting with policies, and China is uniquely positioned to do it because it's a centralized, top-down political system where the central government can direct provincial and local governments to implement their experiments and their policies. Of course, it's very difficult to do in a country like, say, America, right? You can't, a lot of places are actually run by different parties. So if something that works in Boston, Washington cannot say, okay, California, you try that too. That doesn't work. But in China, because it's a top-down, centralized form of governance, they could actually do that. Okay. And the third is entrepreneurial governance. What that means is the Chinese governance involves intense competition among the regions and the cities. So every region, every city is trying to compete for capital, for businesses, to get their GDP up or whatever the KPI is. Okay. So if you excel, officials get move up. Okay, so entrepreneur. So if you go to a county, go to a city, you'll find the party secretaries in those places behaving like entrepreneurs in the private market sector. They want to make it, and they constantly think of ways to deliver on their KPI. Okay, so the on meritocratic governance, I'd like to go a little bit further. This is how the system works. This is a picture I've done many years ago, and it still holds true today. What happens is the China civil service. Okay, or civil service is actually not the right term because it's a politically directed civil service, not an independent bureaucracy. Okay, so essentially it's the party. Okay, the party. So you have a large number of people who join the party at a very in college or out of college. Okay, then a portion of those choose to enter into public service. Okay, so at the bottom you have a very large pool, as you can see from the pyramid, and when they enter civil service or enter the party state, let's call it, there are three places that they could enter into civil service. Okay, they can go into direct government service, which is civil service, or they could go to state-owned enterprises. Okay, or they could go to a social organization like a university or a welfare program, or what have you. Okay, and the three components are you can travel among the three components. You can be in civil service for a couple of years and move to a state-owned enterprise, and so it's a cycle. Okay, and so these officials they going at the bottom level, and they get moved up in those three parts of that pyramid. Sometimes interchange among them. But based on meeting their KPI, whatever they are, and when they meet their KPI, they move to the next level and to the next level, all the way to the top. It's a 20-30 year process. So by the way, by the time that they get to the very top, which is the sort of high Chinese officialdom, the G level, there are only 40,000 of them. Okay, out of close to 1 million at the bottom. So then, of course, above that, there are about 300 to 400 members of the Central Committee, which is the highest ruling body, which elects the Politburo and its standing committee. Okay, so that's how the system works. So it's a performance-based system. It's almost like a company. You enter at the bottom, at the entry-level position, and you have to prove yourself. And every 3, 4, 5 years, you get one step up. And it's brutal competition. Most people, don't make it even, don't make even through the middle part, let alone the top. So by the time you get to the 40,000 group, you're probably in your 40s, maybe 50, and you probably run large cities or very big counties, maybe even a small area comprised of multiple counties, or a pretty big state-owned enterprise, or maybe a university. Okay, so by the time you get to the 40,000, these people are extremely experienced and capable. Another thing I wanted in history, in the past, a lot of people say that it's a one-party state, right? So it's going to get very ossified because you can't, in an electoral or liberal democracy, you don't like a government, you can vote it out. You don't like a party, you can vote it out and change your party. So it's very easy to correct course, what's called self-correction, right? But the assumption is if you have a one-party state, it's more like an authoritarian system, and because there's only one party, there's no competition, so you can't correct course, you can't self-correct, you can't change. That is not true in this particular party state in the past. Okay, so in fact, the Chinese party state has implemented the greatest range of political and policy changes in the world, compared with any other country, I would argue. So this is, I drew a simple line, show you how big the swings have been in Chinese politics under that one-party rule. In 1950, at the beginning of the People's Republic, we had radical land collectivization, okay, which is enormous revolution to collectivize land and put them into national ownership. Then in 1960, we had the Great Leap Forward, which is a disaster. Then they changed course. In the early 1960s, they had almost pseudo land privatization, which is not in here, but it was a short period. Then we had Cultural Revolution, which is, again, another catastrophic mistake. But after that, they changed course again. In the late 1970s, 1980, we began with Deng Xiaoping's market reform, which took the country from a pro-agrarian economy into a behemoth in the global economy. And of course, in around 2012, we began the current Xi Jinping era, which is also a very different era compared with the Deng Xiaoping market reform era. So the system has been able to engineer a lot of changes over the last 70 years. Of course, the question is, can it continue to adapt and continue to change, continue to reform? And now, my argument today is that we're entering a new era where the party state, through its meritocratic system, we have some early proof, although still early, that it can adapt to a very, very new era and with very brand new challenges, different challenges from the past. So we all know, everybody knows, the Chinese economy had grown tremendously. It's a great success, but it came with many byproducts. 3 of them are major problems that came with the rapid economic growth in the last 30, 40 years. Okay, one was political corruption. Okay, up until about 2012, the Chinese political system had become very corrupt. A lot of corrupt officials that work with business people in those heydays of rapid development. So official corruption. Okay. Second is inequality. So our wealth disparity had grown tremendously. Although everybody became better off if they compare to themselves from the past, but the disparity has grown. Our Gini coefficient has grown to a very high number. and inequality had become a major social problem, just like in many other countries through this process of globalization. But China is a socialist country, so inequality has become a central problem in today's Chinese society. Third, of course, is environmental degradation. In its search and drive for speed and rapid development, they've destroyed the ecology. It destroyed the environment in many ways. And this in Beijing, in the capital city, 5, 6, 7 years ago, you could hardly ever see a blue sky. You couldn't even see 20, 30 meters ahead of you every single day, and very harmful air. Okay, and rivers are being polluted, water, land. So the environmental degradation had been massive. Now, what's been happening in the last 5 years? We now have a new doctrine. The party state had put forward a new doctrine of political governance and their KPIs and their goals going forward in the next 10, 20 years. They put forward a couple of things. One is the Global Development Initiative, and it's a new kind of development proposition. They call it inclusive development or holistic development. So they put environment as a part of the development proposition. Okay, and they instituted. They've changed the mix of KPI. Remember, when we were talking about meritocratic governance, you move these officials up through the ranks, and at that time, for the last 30 years or 40 years, the only real criteria, the only real performance stick is GDP. Okay, you achieve your GDP goal, you move up in officialdom. You fail at that, you stay or you get demoted. Okay, now they're putting in a much more complicated set of KPIs because we're in the 19th Party Congress. They have said that the primary contradiction of Chinese society had now changed. Before, it was the lack of development was the primary contradiction. Primary contradiction is political lexicon for the main problem. Okay, now the primary contradiction is no longer the lack of development, but unbalanced development. And unbalanced development means inequality and the environment. Okay, so now all these things on this screen have now replaced GDP as a single performance measure. Now they have to look at the environment, the green. Economic growth is only now 9.2% of the KPI. It used to be close to 100%, but environmental quality has gone to 19.3%, ecological protection, resource utilization, all of these have come into this to form a new, more complicated KPI to evaluate officials and whether to promote them. So let's talk about the 3 great challenges and 3 byproducts that come with rapid economic development in the last 30, 40 years, right? One, of course, I said, is political corruption. And since 2012, the party had implemented one of the most severe, the harshest anti-corruption drive in history. Okay, an enormous number of officials had been, a total of 3.2 million. Imagine that. These are sitting officials or even retired ones who had corrupt practices were punished, were arrested. Okay, and included 254 so-called tigers. And tigers are officials that moved into the very top, near the top of that pyramid that I showed. Okay, so and this is the number of people that have been punished and arrested for corruption. So it's very, very harsh, and we believe all indications show that corrupt practices have dropped dramatically and in a short period of time. This campaign began in 2012, and about 9 years ago. They kicked in earnest in probably 2013, 2014. So maybe 7, 8 years, they've cleaned up the official system for corruption for now. Okay. Second is inequality. So the party, the two things that have been happening in the last 5 years, especially since the 19th Party Congress. The party had led a drastic campaign to eliminate absolute poverty in China, which is a big job because even with tremendous economic growth, everybody being better off, we still had close to 100 million people living under absolute poverty line in China in 2016, 2017. So the party began a campaign sending 3 million officials into poor villages to alleviate poverty, institute policies to lift the very bottom up to at least above the absolute poverty line. And that campaign ended with a great success a few months ago. In China, the last county in Guizhou province was lifted out of poverty, absolute poverty. So I think it's also the first time in history where the Chinese government had ensured 1.4 billion people, they all lived above at least the absolute poverty line, albeit it's still a very low bar. Still a lot of improvements need to be made, but it's a historic and unprecedented achievement. So the population under poverty has been dropping steadily. So I'm just showing some numbers here. Government funding for poverty alleviation every year has been going up dramatically. This is on RMB. So in 2020s, they spent 350 billion RMB on poverty alleviation. The second thing, major campaign is antitrust and common prosperity. So in the last 20 years, because the tremendous growth in the new economy, we got big platform technology companies, just like in America. You got Amazon, we got Taobao, whatever America got, we have. And these companies have become behemoths. They control everybody's lives. They become monopolies. And they began to collect rents. And also they treat their workers badly. So there's very little labor protection for a very large number of workers of the Chinese workforce because what we will call a phenomenon called a buyer's monopoly. So the buyers of labor, right? So the government has now instituted policies and began a campaign to break monopolistic behaviors. I'm sure if you follow China, you read in the papers, you read in media that even Alibaba and all these big platform companies are now their activities are being curtailed. Last, on the environment, on ecology, we asked the question, can we have our cake and eat it too? On one side, we have to keep developing because we still have to improve people's standard of living. On the other side, we have to now care about the ecology, in the environment. Can we do both is the question. And recently I've done two case studies on this. One is in Dali, where in Yunnan province, just 2 days ago, they held the World Biodiversity Conference in Yunnan province, what's called COP15. Many world leaders came on video, remotely. This is an amazing example. This was in Yunnan province, one of the most beautiful spot in China, on southwestern China. And Dali has Erhai, which is one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. And it was pristine before, but because of the economic development, the water quality was destroyed. In 2016, if you go to Dali, the entire lake and the area surrounded have become highly polluted, okay? Very dangerous to health. Because expansion in tourism industry, look at that, I mean, this is the kind of water that they were dealing with. Then beginning in 2016, they went into an overdrive to clean up the system. And this case is unprecedented in its scale and speed. We were there I was there just 3 days ago. Our high is pristine. Out of the 365 days a year, maybe 280 days, the water is above drinkable level, okay? And a dramatic increase in biodiversity. 300 new species have been found in the area. And you could see this is a very large scale project, but smaller scale projects like this are happening across the country. Yet at the same time, GDP has grown at a very healthy pace. From 90 billion RMB in the Dali area, which is sort of like a large county in China, okay, not even a province. 90 billion GDP in 2015 to 27 billion in 2017, which is a significant growth. At the same time, the environment improved. Second case, which I did also with my team very recently, a couple of weeks ago, a smaller place, a smaller county in Zhejiang province called Pujiang, which also had, it was a mountainous region, so it was very poor before 20 years ago. Because it was in the mountains, it found it hard to develop, so it attracted a big industry into that area, the artificial crystal industry, okay? And then in a short number of years, it became the crystal capital of the world, a huge export of crystal, and became very successful, very wealthy, but the process of crystal making was highly destructive to the environment, okay? So, and it was a mountainous region with a lot of trees, a lot of nature, a lot of water, and all the water had become like cafe latte. Very, very destructive story. And the workshops are fragmented. There are many small ones, and they turn out they have no rules to govern their pollution. Okay, this is what the place looked like. Even in 2018, it looked like this. 2017, actually. Yet then, beginning in 2016, 2017, they began to clean up. And they instituted and now this particular campaign is now being replicated across the country, called 5 Water Governance System. We don't have time to go into details, but suffice to say that the entire region was cleaned up in about 3 years. I was just there over the National Day holiday. This is what it looked like now. People are swimming, and this is what it looks like now, the water behind me. And the whole area has returned mostly, almost 90% of its ecological health before the crystal industry destroyed it. So these are my 2 case studies. So I think the preliminary conclusion I'd like to share with you is I believe that this Chinese governance system with this meritocratic system, they're able to adapt because they could change KPI for the officials that want to move up to include a broader range of performance measures. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Lee. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. One thing I have learned is that critically, the countries that have started to succeed in getting people out of poverty and have been able to move towards serious prosperity that can be tangible and seen are those that have started to endeavor into long-term planning, institutionalized it, and never changed when the laws changed and when the governments changed, but continued to rally everybody, the country, the society, towards one dream of prosperity, and they continue to adapt. Thank you for those lessons. We will now hand over to Dr. Lubisi, and he can also bring us his views on this part of ours in South Africa. He taught me one thing, but he says it's our path. We will make it as we walk it. So I continue to hope to hear how more we continue to walk this path of ours as we walk it as South Africa. Dr. Lubisi.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I would like to greet the leadership that is attending this session in the form of former President Khalid Motlanthe, ministers, deputy ministers, directors general. I wish to thank Dr. Lee for sharing this space with me this morning. And it's always very, very inspirational to listen to Dr. Lee. I've listened to him several times, and always very inspiring in the manner in which he deals with matters. I will do a very brief presentation, and I hope that that it works now. I'll do a very brief introduction before we go into the discussion with Dr. Lee. I started reflecting a bit on the notion of merit and meritocracy, a notion which is very, very, very useful indeed as we transform our governments, not only in South Africa, but throughout the world. We need to go back and reflect a bit. Clearly, meritocracy is based on the notion that one's advances in society should be based on merit, not on anything else. In other words, you should, as an individual and as a person, have merit to be promoted or to be employed or to be deployed, and nothing else. Meritocracy is emerged in various parts of the world as a result of real societal problems. It's not primordial. It's not something that's primordial. It's something that was meant to solve problems that various countries and societies faced. And this, among others, was the problem of corruption, patronage, both familial and political patronage, and favoritism. So the idea is to ensure that whoever gets in is not advantaged because of who you know or who gave birth to you. By far, China, in my view, has been the leading society in terms of advancing meritocracy, largely influenced by its history and by Confucius, who detested the idea that leaders should govern on the basis of the status they had inherited from their families. And so it runs very deep in the Chinese DNA, the notion of meritocracy. Now, Confucius clearly advanced the idea that leaders should govern on the basis of their own merit and not on the social collective that they belong to. Now, this notion of Chinese notion of meritocracy or a meritocratic society has influenced many, many societies, including India, Europe, some parts of West Africa, and indeed ourselves in this, our own republic. Now, in the republic, Plato posits 5 types of regimes aristocracy, timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny, which I won't go into. On face value, it seems to me that Plato saw meritocracy as key to democracy and its sustenance. So it's, and earlier Socrates had posited himself that people should do what they are best at, and not what their clans believe they can do on the basis of perceived inherited abilities or capabilities. Clearly, the isolation of meritocracy from one's historical embeddedness in the social division of labor can sometimes prove to be theoretically flawed, especially in the context of the development of the post-apartheid polity. What we are saying basically here, and we're trying to problematize the notion of meritocracy in our own context. Now, if you look at it theoretically, meritocracy is an individualist ideological concept. And you have to look at it vis-a-vis the collectivist ideology of an individual being embedded in a historic collective, be it a class or be it gender, race, nationality, or any other social classification for that matter. Herein lies the dilemma of the notion of meritocracy. Particularly if you look at what we have gone through as a country in our history, because what it does, meritocracy looks at you as an individual. It doesn't say because you are Black or because you are a woman, etc., you have certain rights to certain positions in society. It looks at you as what you have achieved or what you can achieve in cases of meritocratic potential. So it's a dilemma that clearly, as we grapple with meritocracy and building meritocratic bureaucracy in South Africa, it is something that we need to look at. It's a balancing act that we need to consistently watch as we go forward. Now, particularly if you look at where we come from for almost 730 years, 370 years rather, we had serious racial, ethnic, and gender profiling in the Republic. And that is where, when we deal with whether we can now shift and say that doesn't matter anymore, all that matters now is the individual. The question that would arise is, do the individuals have equal opportunities and equal resources to be able to compete fairly? These are questions that we need to ask ourselves. Because for all these years, white males were exclusively prioritized as the sole monopoly for the social provision of public goods and services by both the colonial state as well as the apartheid state. And these patterns have actually remained very stubborn, even post-apartheid. I don't have the figures with me, but it is common cause that if you go, for instance, to the ownership patterns and the management patterns on firms that are listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. These patterns are quite clear for everyone to see. Now, so given the historical social exclusion inherent in apartheid and colonialism, the question remains whether this social exclusion can be resolved by a new exclusion based on an individualist demerit system. And that's a debate that we in our country need to have. It's a tension. It's a contradiction. But whether it is an antagonistic contradiction, the jury is still out. My view is it is a contradiction that can be managed, because if we do not manage this contradiction, we will then be held back and allow rather arbitrary ways of social selection to persist in the same manner that these arbitrary ways persisted under apartheid. Now, I then looked at the issue, want to look at the issue of transformation and the transformative mission. The transformation clearly should always be contextual. There is no one size fits all do-it-yourself manual of how to do transformation. It is contextually depends on what it is that you seek to transform. What purpose is that transformative mission? So it's those issues that we need to talk to. In our case, transformation is based on our context of the National Democratic Revolution and the post-1994 Constitution, which make very critical promises to the people of South Africa. Both the National Democratic Revolution and the South African Constitution seek to transform South Africa into a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic, and united country. In practice, this involves the uprooting of the social, political, and economic machinations of the apartheid system in all its manifestation, particularly as it targeted Black people and women. The preamble to our Constitution captures this transformative mission very succinctly when it says, we therefore adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic, so as to, 1, heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. 2, lay the foundation for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law. 3, improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person. And 4, build a united and democratic South Africa, able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. Now, the Constitution further elaborates on the exact content of the promise of the National Democratic Revolution in the Bill of Rights as contained in Chapter 2 of our Constitution. And here, the Constitution makes promises around the equality before the law, human dignity, freedom and security, the right to religion, freedom of expression, political rights, rights to citizenship, labor rights, freedom to trade, and freedom of profession, environmental rights. Eric was speaking about environmental rights, property rights, the right to housing, the right to health care, food, water, and social security, children's rights, as well as the right to education and other rights. So this is what our democracy promises. This is contained in the Constitution. Hence, therefore, the Constitution for us becomes a social contract that binds us together as South Africans. This is what we promise to each other, to one another. So public administration as a critical element of the state or component of the state becomes critical for the realization of the promise of the Constitution. Hence, the values of public administration as elucidated in section 195 of the Constitution of the Republic. Now, the key questions to ask ourselves is, to what extent have we lived up to the promise of the post-apartheid Constitution? To what extent have we entrenched the developmentalist intentions of the Constitution in the state and in general, and in public administration in particular? What will it take for South Africa to achieve an effective state machinery that it can deliver on the promise of the Constitution and the National Democratic Revolution? And what lessons can we learn from other polities, such as China and other polities that we interact with? I want to briefly touch on this developmentalist notion that is firmly entrenched in our Constitution, and draw from where it comes from. Chalmers Johnson, in his famous book on the Ministry of Trade and Investment in Japan, came up with this notion of the developmental state, although the developmental state in itself is a rather old concept. It predates Chalmers Johnson's treatise on MITI in Japan. I've said elsewhere, and we always say South Africa wishes to be a developmental state, or even some say South Africa is a developmental state. Well, I think this is an aspiration that we have. It is an aspiration we have. As I've said elsewhere, that no donkey becomes a horse simply by calling itself a horse. It doesn't work that way. So a state doesn't become developmental simply because it calls itself that. In fact, as I've said elsewhere, many of the countries that are called developmental state never in their history called themselves developmental. It is the characteristics that ex post facto have been seen in the development of those countries that qualified them ex post facto to be characterized as developmental states. And some of these which come from what Chalmers Johnson refers to, brings to our attention. For instance, the state's ability to set clear priorities, especially in respect of economic development, and its ability to drive those priorities. Because it's one thing to set priorities, but if you are not able to drive those priorities, they become theoretical in nature. Secondly, is a political system and an environment in which the bureaucracy is given the space to function effectively and to be able to take the initiative. You also need, clearly, if you are going to give that bureaucracy that space, that bureaucracy must be highly capable. You need a capable bureaucracy that can deliver on the promises as contained in the Constitution. The state should have the ability to intervene in the market economy. And what Dr. Lee was talking about in regard to China, China has got the ability to intervene quite decisively. And itself, of course, it has gone through various additions. If you recall the red line that Dr. Lee put in from the time of the agricultural collectivization through the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and Deng's market interventions, up to the new era now under President Xi Jinping. There has been different models of such intervention, and it also, again, it is trial and error. There is no one size fits all, do-it-yourself manual style handbook that you can use for purposes of intervention. Now, in the case of Japan, from what you see from Chairman Johnson, the setting up of driving agencies, like MITI in the case of Japan, agencies that are well endowed with thought leadership, with coordination, planning capabilities, implementation and monitoring, as well as the authority. And in the case of Japan, an indirect control over the state's budget. In other words, if one aspires to be a developmental state, the center must hold. It cannot be a situation where it's a laissez-faire situation where everyone can do whatever they wish to do. The center must hold, while of course respecting the rights of citizens as indicated in the Constitution. But what we know, and I've said this in different words, that the developmental state exists in time and space. It cannot be taken as an ahistorical one-size-fits-all. We have to see where the country is, and we have to understand its context. We have to understand its history. Now, let us look at geopolitics at the time of the emergence of the post-apartheid state in South Africa. If we look towards the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, we see the domino collapse of East European bloc socialism. And when that happened, we saw the emergence of what the Americans then called the New World Order, which was characterized by, among other things, the dominance of neoliberalism, the systemic attacks on the legitimacy of the state, and the outsourcing, therefore, of state functions to private firms, because there was increasing incredulity towards the state. The state was begging for its own legitimacy and survival. Now, the post-apartheid state is then born right at the time when the global neoliberal ideology becomes dominant. leading to the post-apartheid state to being forced to assume a character of a transactional state, which is preoccupied with facilitating transactions with private firms performing traditional state functions, and which significantly weakened public administration of the post-apartheid state. The emergence of this transactional state also brought about very seriously perverse values, such as rent seeking and corruption. Because if you get preoccupied with outsourcing what government is supposed to be doing, you have to choose who you outsource to. And therefore you become preoccupied with selling the right to deliver those services, public goods and services, to various companies. And it's a reality that we're still grappling with today. Now, clearly, now we've got increasing calls to transform the state into an entrepreneurial state, as Dr. Lee indicated earlier on. One of the characteristics or part of the DNA of the Chinese state is this entrepreneurialism. Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who taught on this forum a few months ago, writes a lot about the entrepreneurial state, using various examples of how the state, for instance, in the United States, through largely the US military, sought to commercialize, package and commercialize its own inventions, and therefore became a leader in entrepreneurial activities of the US economy. And then, as I said earlier on, the call is for highly capable bureaucrats. Without those highly capable bureaucrats who are entrepreneurial, who are autonomous, it becomes a pipe dream to have a transformative state. Now, the late Professor Thandika Mkandawire posits that developmental states have got two components, mainly an ideological component and a structural component. The ideological component refers to the policy element driven by political leaders, whereas the structural component talks more to how states are organized, technically and administratively, and how bureaucracies operate. In my view, therefore, if we accept Professor Mkandawire's assertion, for the developmental state to succeed, there is a need for the ideological and the structural components to operate in a political administrative tango. It should be a tango. It should not be a tug of war. The question is then we ask ourselves is about the maturity of the political administrative interface in South Africa, as ably done so in the National Development Plan. Does our political administrative interface characterize a tango, or does it characterize a brawl? And these are the questions which we need to talk to. Now, as I come to the end, we've got a whole new world. We're not in 1950. We're not in 2010 either. We are not even in 2015. A whole new world has emerged. And bureaucracies the world over are trying to grapple to come to terms with these new realities, which are largely brought about in recent times by the fourth industrial revolution. And now with COVID-19. These are new realities which cannot be ignored by bureaucracies. States have to grapple with this. These new realities require us to reconsider how we provide public goods and services in this new world. And it calls for us to ask what type of bureaucrat will be fit for purpose in these new realities. We cannot go on with business as usual. Otherwise, what we do or the people we have in our employ as the state will not be fit for purpose in the new situation that we are facing. How should we as the state reorganize in order to function in a new way that takes into consideration this new reality? These are questions that bureaucracies and governments should respond to as we go forward with the mission to build transformative and meritocratic bureaucracies. These are the questions that of late we have to respond to. Program Director, thank you very much. Let me stop there, and I look forward to useful discussion with the attendance today and as well with Dr. Lee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lubisi. I will start by looking for the questions that have been asked so that as you go into your conversation with Dr. Lee, you start answering them as you also help us ponder on those three questions that have been indicated by the principal. Arena is asking, what is more important? Is it more important to be a good bureaucrat or to follow the party vision? And follows up by saying, I am unsure if meritocracy is the silver bullet for South Africa's public service at this point in time. The South African public service has a corporatist characteristics that are also having a way of rewarding structures and incentives, but this does not guarantee maturity of organizational behavior. Rather, there is an added competitive environment, and merit is incredibly important. Motlokwa says, it seems that being a one-party, one-vision state has never worked for China. Would Dr. Lee advise South Africa to consider this route to realize its dream of being a developmental state? Kevin has a few questions. This is what we in South Africa call sustainable reporting in terms of the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit, a balanced perspective. I see that in China, you talk about working your way up from the bottom. We in South Africa, on the other hand, have a tendency of parachuting employees at highest ranks, instead of them starting from the bottom up, having your roots in the ground. Further on, he says, I am of the view that we cannot just import the Chinese system of governance as the ingredients that have made up the Chinese system and that of the South African system are vastly different. The variables, which are laws, the economic system, as well as the policy at play in both systems are different, and hence they need to be studied at length. On the social makeup, he's talking about the Chinese, are also not as diverse as the situation is in South Africa, and also taking into account our imbalances of the past. I would also like to ask, or there are further questions, Dr. Joe Mavuso, can entrepreneurial governance not undermine human rights in South Africa? Mekubai, would it be inaccurate to assert that even a party agenda needs meritocracy for its full and effective implementation? And there are also part from Papin Kodi thanking Dr. Lubisi and Dr. Lee for the presentation. And he says to Dr. Lubisi, will you elaborate on one, the nature and roles of the community development level participation or participatory bureaucratic structures, that is the PAO China, in the capacity of the Chinese state to sustain societal wide growth path, to the extent to which the historical cultural legacy has been there. And he also talked to the issue of what has been termed the civilizational state that manifests itself in the configuration of the present day Chinese state bureaucracy. And to Dr. Libisi, Papi asked, do you think the state of South Africa will achieve meaningful societal aspirations outside the party state configuration? Secondly, whereas the post-colonial Weberian bureaucracy was designed to export raw material out of South Africa and to undevelop our society, is it realistic to continue to, is it realistic to continue to expect a fundamentally and philosophically flawed bureaucracy to deliver South Africa's prosperity without radically rethinking the structure and meaning of South Africa's specific meritocracy? I would like to leave the questions at that and ask that we have the two panelists start answering those questions as they give us and get into their personal one-to-one, man-to-man conversation for the next few minutes. Thank you very much. Dr. Lee, if you can start, and then we give Dr. Lubisi some time to catch the breath, and then we get into the whole issue of your conversation. Thank you very much.
All right, good. Thank you. These are very good questions. Let me kind of answer some of these questions in a way that, in a more coherent way. Yeah. So we've been using those words. I've tried to avoid using the word meritocracy, which is a loaded term. So I've been trying to use the word meritocratic government, which is less defined and less fixed word. Meritocracy really means a set of things that may not be exactly what I mean. So what I mean by meritocratic governance is simply that we have a system where performance measures are predefined or externally defined, external to the individual official. Okay, so it's not like a company. If I'm a salesman, if I'm a research person, the company, my boss, the CEO, or the board defines performance measurements that I'm supposed to meet in order for me to get my bonus and move up. That's number one. So merit means track record. Merit means whether you deliver on the performance that the measurements are defined for you, that is not defined by you, but defined by others, by the system. Second is upward mobility. Meritocratic governance means that can people have a way of moving up that's not patronage or corruption, but based on performance. Okay. And third, I think most importantly, at least in the Chinese case, meritocratic governance has a normative aspect. It's just it's not just a technical way of promoting officials and running the state. It has a normative aspect in that there is an ethical and moral compass to meritocratic governance or meritocracy. So what the merits by definition include what is right? Are you doing the right thing? So what's the end of the state? What's the end of our society? If the end is common prosperity or egalitarianism, then are you achieving those goals? If the end is environmental protection, if the end is income or growth, or all of the above, or a combination. So there's a moral aspect. The end, in South Africa's case, the Constitution, which I just learned, spells the end of the current South African state, which is to dismantle apartheid's legacies, to create a more equal society. And that is the normative aspect of the state. And what's meritocratic? When I say meritocratic, it includes that normative aspect. Okay, and the second is, Dr. Lovisi talked about a very interesting aspect that is that I noticed. I think he said, I didn't catch the exact words, but the ideological and administrative parts have to be entangled, dance the tango. So I think that is critical, and that's why I don't like to use the term meritocratic bureaucracy. So in China's case, it's the party state. So the ideological and administrative aspects or bureaucratic aspects are in one. They're not only embraced in a tango, but they're actually one body. So the party holds the ideological and political end, and the bureaucracy is run infused with the party. And I think that's, to me, that's critical for a successful developmental state or transformative state, is that the political vision, I think one of the questions was that what's the goal? Is it to be a good bureaucrat or to follow the party vision? So in the Chinese case, you have to do both. You're not a good bureaucrat if you don't follow the party vision. So bureaucracy or meritocratic bureaucracy, if you have to use that term, has the politics and ideology, which and the normative aspects embedded in it. Thank you.
Eric, I'm thinking about the matter of ensuring that there is the meritocratic advancement of public servants, if you like, to higher levels of the public service, as you showed with that pyramid, a very useful pyramid indeed. Could it be that China is able to manage this because it's got a very organized and strong center called the organization department?
Yeah.
The organization department sifts people. You can't just emerge from nowhere and be seen all of a sudden to be leading organizations that you are not capable of leading. Could it be that one of the reasons why we are not moving as rapidly as China does is that we don't have, in our country, it's not possible to have something like the organization department. We have a regulatory a body, which is the DPSA, which kind of puts the norms, it controls the normative space. The National Development Plan in South Africa calls for a greater involvement of the Public Service Commission in ensuring that we manage the meritocratic advancement of public servants in particular, but I think broadly in public administration, but it's largely public servants. We need to strengthen organizations in this country, such as the Public Service Commission. it won't obviously reach the stage of the organization department. It's not possible because the organization department, as you initially correctly indicate, is also ideologically driven. It's a party structure.
That's right.
It's not a government structure. So I thought one should bring that into this conversation.
That's exactly right. The organization department is critical, is the nerve center of everything we've been talking about here with the Chinese system. And you're right, the organization department is a party organ, not exactly an administrative or bureaucratic organ. It belongs to the party. So the party, the central committee, party run by the central committee, the party sets the goals for the nation. They set the end. What's just like the way you spelled out in the South African Constitution, what is the end of the current South African state? We know that. What's the moral and ethical end of your country? And the party sets that, and the organization department is in charge of selecting and promoting people who will execute on that vision, execute on that political end. So it's fused in one. So we don't have a bureaucracy that just does the technicalities of state. Every bureaucrat, if you want to move up, that is, every bureaucrat is a party cadre at the same time. So I wonder what that means for a country like South Africa. Of course, has a different constitution, different structure, but I mean, I'm hypothesizing that a developmental state, a state that wants to move from point A to point B, a state that has an end. You're not there yet. You need to move from point A to point B. I wonder. I'm hypothesizing that it is important to have the political end being fused with the bureaucratic implementation arms. But how do you do that? In China, the way they do it, of course, is fusing the party and the state. The party is the state. That's why you call it party state. But in a structure like South Africa, how do you tango, at least you have a tango. If it's not a complete fusion, but a tango, a successful and coherent tango over long duration. That's another thing that you got to have, for this kind of system to work. I think for developmental state to work, you have to have this last long enough. But in an electoral system, you change governments a lot, and you change leadership, and so So how do you make sure that the political end is embedded, or at least has a significant guidance power of bureaucratic implementations?
Yeah, I think Dr. Lee, that is a question of the relationship between strategy and tactics. Strategically, I think we are at one about what South Africa needs to achieve. What should be the end goal? What is the ethical end, as you indicate, of the South African state? What is the raison d'etre of the existence of the South African state? And that is contained in the Constitution of the Republic quite clearly. And of course, as you correctly say, one of the biggest problems we have is that we tend to be short-termist in the manner in which we plan. We tend to be short-termist, and we tend sometimes to confuse the state with the government. A government lasts for 5 years,
right.
But the state is not a 5-year enterprise. The state is a permanent enterprise. And that relationship between government and the state is something that sometimes is not quite ideal in the manner in which we manage it. Because clearly, the way in which we do it in our country, I'll speak from the side of the current governing party. It has a policy conference every 5 years, based on its historic mission. And it decides policies. These are the policies that will be advancing. It takes it to its national conference, and the conference adopts those policies. Those policies become the basis on which that party, and of course other parties do the same. They then adopt electoral manifestos and say, you elect us. If you elect us, this is what we will do, in pursuit of their historic mission to transform South Africa into a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic, and prosperous country. This is what we will do. And once that happens, the party is elected. That manifesto is then taken into the state and transformed into a 5-year plan for the state, which we often call the medium-term strategic framework. And it is on that basis that clear performance indicators are then set for everyone to say, this is what you shall achieve in the next 5 years. We might not be doing this very, very well, but the intention is precisely that, to ensure that the public servants or those who are in public administration, whether they're in the public service, whether they are in state-owned entities or they are in organs of state, they all need to pursue the objectives as set out in the medium-term strategic framework, which derives its goals from the electoral manifestos or electoral manifesto of the elected party.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lubisi and Dr. Lee. May I take this opportunity to allow the Commissioner of SARS to make his input and our Minister, Mayor Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, to follow. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Dr. Lee and Dr. Lubisi. I hope Dr. Lubisi is learning how to enjoy retirement as well, my friend. Thank you for the input. Both inputs, I think, require significant unpacking and discussion, and I hope my other colleague, the principal, will create such platforms in the future. I have a thesis, Dr. Lee, that I want to test with you. Firstly, to make the point that I think the whole notion of creating a context based on meritocracy, experimentation, and entrepreneurial behavior, I think is absolutely aligned with my personal philosophy, and I would like to explore how one creates a culture within the state that actually nurtures that. Because I think at the moment we in South Africa are so driven by a clean audit, and I'm the first one to say that clean audits and governance is absolutely high. But if winning means getting an audit with no findings, the best way to get there is not to experiment, not to try anything new, and not to innovate. But I just love that notion of those three principles that underpin the context. I also noted in your expression of how the hierarchy works that meritocracy is not without context, because people can be competent but corrupt.
Right.
People be competent but serve a different purpose. And I think what I took from your message was that competence and meritocracy included the ability to deliver a specific outcome, which was predetermined. And so it was not only about your cleverness or your smarts, but your ability to deliver against that outcome. And in your case, you mentioned economic growth, because economic growth was the medium towards social inclusion. So the radical thesis I want to test, and I am old enough to be cynical, and I've been in leadership most of my lifetime, so the thesis that's emerging in my mind is that it is less about the form of government, and it is less about whether there is a one-party state or not. But the countries who appear to be winning have organized to win. And for me, some of the principles that emerges, and I want to test this with you, is firstly, it is the competence of leadership, not necessarily the political ideology or any other notion, but the competence, the hard ability of leaders to deliver against the defined outcomes. And that is tested at an individual level, but also at a systemic level, because systems of leadership are really what is important, as opposed to just individual leaders who are competent. So that's the first. The second is an uncompromising commitment to a transformative social cause. And then thirdly, that the ultimate outcome is building social cohesion and social inclusion. If a form of government can achieve those things, it is less about their form and more about the delivery of those outcomes. And one could possibly live in a world where a social democratic government that lives up to those principles can deliver the same outcomes as a single party political system based on socialist political ideology. And that's my thesis that's emerging as I think about myself as a leadership scholar. And then the last point is a clear delivery or individual performance where there is clear consequences. If you don't deliver, you are out. If you corrupt, you get locked up. And the consequence is what matters. And so for me, that's the thesis I want to test with you. Thank you.
Many thanks, Commissioner. Can we ask Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma to make her input, and we take it from there?
Thank you very much. If you would allow me to switch off my video, my network is not very good. Well, first, let me thank the panelists. I've enjoyed this session very much. I wish I could have more time to attend such sessions because they are very informative. And I want to just start with what Dr. said about the three elements of the state. As the commissioner said, I completely agree with that, especially besides the meritocratic and the entrepreneurial, but also experimental, because we tend to look at what other people have done somewhere else without sometimes looking at the conditions under which that was done and the conditions under which we are going to perform that. So I think the experimental part I really like, because then you can experiment here and see it works and expand. But I also think that in our situation, 5-year plans don't really work to transform more than 300 years of colonialization. I think we need long-term plans. Then we can break them down to 5, 1 year, 10 year, but I believe we do need a long-term plan, because when there is a long-term plan, then both the political and the administration can actually tango, knowing exactly what they are tangoing to. And I tend to disagree, but he will convince me. I know Cassius will convince me. When he says the administration should be autonomous from who? Because I think the administration should, if there is a long-term plan, know this is what needs to be implemented and be gauged against that, but also know that the party line and the long-term plan should be going together. But I agree if he means that in implementation and being a capable administration, they should be given that space. Then if that's what it means, I would agree with it. I'd also think that one of the things we haven't done very well is to project the public service as something that young people should aspire to, working in the public service. At the moment, it's like the random selection. When there's a post there, they will apply. When they see something else somewhere else that gives them a bigger package, they go. We have not inculcated that culture, that being a public service is a noble thing to do. It's something that the country admires and needs. And therefore, we don't have the same as what is there in China, where somebody can start at the bottom and go up right till the end. We don't find many of those. So I think one of the things as a country that we should inculcate is not that you succeed by having a lot of money, and therefore young people and all of us are chasing money, but to say we succeed by serving the country to fulfill its historic mission, as you have said, but also to take people out of poverty, out of unemployment, to create a more equal and prosperous society. And if we then say that is what really matters, because at the moment, many young people and old people think what matters is how much money you have and how much money you make. And therefore, you'll see the conspicuous consumption. We were talking to some young people some time back and just asking them, if you had money, what would you do with it? And almost all of them, without exception, I'll buy a very nice car. So we said, okay, if you had a choice to buy a very beautiful, expensive car and build a house, what would you do? They said, we'll still buy a very nice, expensive car. And we said, why? And they said, because nobody knows your house, but they know your car. So we have inculcated that kind of society where what we are, this conspicuous consumption that people must see me, how much money I have, how much material things I have, and service to your nation is not the most important. So I think those are some of the things I think I would like you to comment on. One, just making the public service something that people look up to. And when a child is learning at school, one of their aspirations is to be a public servant and an effective public servant that implements and creates a better life for the people in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Commissioner. I will hand over to Dr. Lee and Dr. Lubisi, and immediately after that will be the principal. Thank you for this inspiring. I hope this conversation will continue as a dialogue in South Africa until we meet the aspirations of being a developmental state. Hopefully by 2030, we'll be talking a different story. Thank you, one. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So let me quickly comment on some of the questions. So I think that a very interesting concept is the concept of competency. And I agree that it doesn't matter. It's not a matter of, it's not the exact form of government. It's whatever form of government you've got, how can you make it so that competent people rise to the top and get to run the country in a competent way. What I've described is how the Chinese system works. And for electoral systems like the one South Africa has, I think, although it's different from other countries, you know, I don't know enough about South Africa to give a intelligent analysis, but I have studied America very closely. So if, the US, of course, is a liberal democracy. They have these elections every 4 years. And, you know, for a long period of time, in the most of the second half, post-World War II, second half of the 20th century, the US seemed to have the ability to elect mostly very capable and competent leaders at different levels of government. Even if they switch parties, they have competent people running the country. Now, in the last 30, after the Cold War, in the last 30, 40 years, that ability has declined significantly, it seems. It's declined in two ways. One is, you know, it did elect at least two very incompetent presidents, George W. Bush and Donald Trump. I mean, you know, they had competent ones. So the first Bush president, I think, was very competent. Reagan was competent, although you may not agree with their politics. And Clinton was reasonable. Obama, who knows? But I think that it's an open and shut case that George W. Bush and Donald Trump were not competent, extremely incompetent. So that's a issue that we should really study and think about how it's the same form of government, yet different performances, right? And there's second aspect in U.S. decline in competence is that even when you have competent people in government, which they do most of the time, these people cannot competently deliver as a collective. So somehow government itself becomes an obstacle for even competent leaders to deliver. And how do you fix that? I think that you know, those are the questions that we should think about if you have elections, and if you have similar structures that you have elections and balance of power, have legislature and executive, all those separate power centers. How do you make it so that competent people get to lead and they can deliver competently?
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Thank you, Chairperson. Let me say I fully agree actually with the sentiments expressed by Dr. Lee, as well as the firm positions which had been put forward by Commissioner Kisweta. I fully agree with his view and what he called his philosophy. I think it's actually it's quite a very useful way of looking at things. In regard to the comments from Minister Dlamini Zuma, let me indicate, Minister, that indeed autonomous, it doesn't mean that public servants or people in public administration should start doing their own things. In fact, it means on the contrary, it means they are something different. Let me start by first saying it would be incorrect, particularly in regard to the public service and even others in public administration, to do something outside the policies of the government and not pursuing what government seeks to achieve, because government has got a contract with the people. It says, elect us, and if you elect us, this is what we'll do. So public servants must ensure that that happens. And in fact, Section 197 of our Constitution says within public administration, there is a public service which must loyally implement the lawful policies of the government of the day. So it is imperative on public servants to implement the policies of the government of the day. That's how they should get measured, whether they are achieving what the government of the day seeks to achieve. If not, as Ed Kitzwetter says, then you shouldn't be in government, really. You should go somewhere else. It's quite clear what the notion of autonomy and it's of what's called embedded autonomy. It's one of the notions of the idea of a developmental state, which says because the state interacts with various elements of society. It interacts with the private sector, with organizations, non-governmental organizations, individuals out there, etc. The notion of autonomy says that the state should be insulated to the extent that it should only pursue the social goals of the government of the day and not be influenced easily by those it interacts with, or be pressured by, say, the private sector. If the private sector says you do this, and the state blinks, and where you get bureaucrats no longer doing what they are supposed to do to achieve common social goals, but they are now bidding, they are doing the bidding of private business, then they are no longer insulated, they are no longer autonomous. That's what we mean by that term. We do not mean that they should be autonomous from the policies, the lawful policies of the government of the day. Let me stop it there, Chairperson, and thank you very much for the conversation. In fact, we could go on for the next 5 hours, but we don't have 5 hours.
Thank you, Dr. Lubisi.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for this. The Dr. Eric Lee, all the way from Shanghai, and Dr. Lubisi in Pretoria, both of them are senior fellows of the National School of Government. We appointed them as senior fellows of the NSG precisely so that they can come into platforms like these ones and provoke us. I'm sure, Dr. Lee, you will agree that part of what assisted with the rapid transformation of the state, in China after 1978 was actually ideas, because the leadership of the country, at the time was able to go to countries like Singapore, Japan, and elsewhere to get ideas of how other nations were doing things, and you went back, you localized them, and you were able to successfully, achieve the end of poverty, as we saw earlier this year. So ideas do matter in the building of capable state wherever you go in the world. And in fact, in the slide you showed, Dr. Lee, and I know you've been propagating it, using that triangle, that filter, that those people who are able to move up the system, yes, know-how matters, but also ideas, because you can't be an experimental state or entrepreneurial unless you are driven by ideas. And so your presence here today, together with the leadership of directors, generals, ministers, the Speaker of Parliament, Deputy Speaker of Parliament was also here, mayors and MECs, is precisely so that we can create this platform to share ideas like this one. So what we did, we ran a Mentimeter. The 3 questions that you were dealing with, we also asked participants to engage with the same questions using a whiteboard platform called Mentimeter. This is what most of them said. This is a word cloud that is generated from Mentimeter. What does it take for societies to rapidly transform? And you can see that one of the words that is bigger there is transformative leadership. That is what most of the people who are attending this webinar said today. Obvious issues of the common purpose, shared vision, credible and a clear path. And some of these are the issues that you mentioned in your interventions. There was a question about, can elected officials and heads of department lead a renaissance? And most people said yes. That's a resounding answer. Hence, in the word cloud, the word yes is bigger. And of course, people mentioned other things as well. What does it take for societies to rapidly transform? I've mentioned that. Transformative leadership is critical, as most people have mentioned. But of course, colleagues, as we gather here to ponder and we're getting perspective from Asia, South Africa, and elsewhere in the world, we do recall that as South Africa, whilst we are dealing with these developmental challenges, grappling with them, elsewhere in the world, countries that we compete with in many ways, this is the type of headlines that are generated. In China, the biggest headline of this year, other than the party celebrating a centenary, was the celebration of the end of poverty. And of course, in the US, because they had seen it as a major threat to them, they were celebrating that they were winning the fight against the COVID pandemic. This is some of the big news of this year, and as I said, other than the elections in the US, as well as the Communist Party of China celebrating the centenary. And then these are the headlines about South Africa happening in the world. Last year, Bloomberg predicted, using their own model, that South Africa by 2030 might be a failed state. This year, the World Bank made a prediction that the next 9 years, this current period might actually be a lost decade. And the economies continue to run with that type of headline. These are very worrying, and for them to be reversed, they require a very conscientious and capable bureaucracy to deal with the challenges confronting many people in South Africa. Finally, the attempts of government as part of the priorities currently is to build a committed, diligent, prudent, masterful, ethical and accountable, and an innovative public service. For that to happen, it means we must be driven by ideas. We must return to the simulator to gain more insight and skills to know how to manage an economy in a rapidly complex world, be able to negotiate compact, and be able to work within the confines and the limits of the law. Because even with the limits of the law as they are, there is still a lot of room for us to maneuver around that. This is what we aspire for in a nutshell in South Africa. And ourselves, the National School of Government, we are playing a key role as a simulator to provide learning opportunities. We are a self-funding government department, so I must do an advert. All of you are invited to return to the simulator. We do charge a fee. Sometimes we don't charge a fee, because after all, this development literature tells us that bureaucracies become what their leadership imagines. If we imagine a bureaucracy that is like a rat, a small and inconsequential creature, as the leadership of this bureaucracy, that will be the outcome, because whatever we imagine will filter down through the system. It is important, therefore, that we need to imagine, we need to aim bigger and be more ambitious in the work that we do. Thank you once again to all of you for being here this afternoon. It was truly an enriching conversation. We value your time and your volunteers in this program, and all those who attended. We hope that you enjoyed your morning with us today. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon and a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, DG. Thanks,
Thank
DGs.
you.
Thanks, ministers.
Thank you.